эти годы, тяжелые годы, 44 мы до 47-го года с трудом здесь. После войны тоже трудные годы были. И кроме всего прочего, еще вот что. И ведь корейцы любят траву, зелень. Слушай, в Узбекистане этой травы навалом было. Так что этой травы много мы поели. Сейчас уже нету столько травы. Ну, что сказать. Раз выжили, значит все нормально. Это самое главное.
I'll show you one more video of his because he actually as a child worked on those collective farms. So what were the conditions also?
Корейцы в основном лист.
So what they did on those state collective farms upon their arrival?
Там занимались. Ну что, и сахарно-свеклой занимались, и нас маленьких посылали убирать это сверху, а вот на пшеничных полях жучков ловили. И иначе они портили весь посев. Вот так. Потом, когда мы подросли в школе немного, на хлопок стали посылать. Иногда директор сам нас мобилизует и давай. Ну, жилья-то там нету, собирать хлопок, это осенью, тепло еще. Кто как устраивался там, собирали тоже.
And I think I'll show you the last video, and then maybe if we have time for questions and answers, Q&A section. But this is actually Korean cemeteries where all those Koreans are buried. Probably the very first generations of the deportees, and it's about the celebration of Hansik, or commemoration of the dead, and the celebration of the day of cold food.
Много здесь похоронено, полное кладбище там. Времени сколько прошло? 37-го года, слушай. Это сколько лет прошло? Даже в 37-м году родился человек. А еще, если там в России родился, значит, еще прибавь, да. И вот так вот. Вот завтра как раз родительский день. 5 апреля на кладбище вместе будут корейцы. Вот завтра обязательно поминание. И этот день такой, и могилу чистят, и приводят в порядок там. И потом, значит, деду обрядную ставят там, посидишь там. Порядок такой. Если вот люди поминают, да, расстелят там, еду привезли там и так далее. Если кто-то посторонний придет, то даже радуются люди, давай, садись с нами вместе.
I think I could tell you much more and like many more things about everything, but maybe it's better if you have some questions or are interested to know maybe something in more details, and from there we can kind of talk a little bit more about history. Yes, please.
I think one of the first questions I have is knowing what you know about the deportation and the region where your ancestors are from. Do you ever wonder what it would be like if that deportation hadn't happened and your family had stayed in North Korea?
Yeah, it's actually a very good question. Thank you. Yeah, this is one thing that we all think a lot about, and that question probably that kind of rises very often. And I think in general, I I think right now that whole deportation or forced resettlement, as our Koreans themselves prefer to call it, for many reasons, it's somehow like debatable. We actually, commemorating the 80th anniversary of this deportation, we actually ask ourselves this question a lot on all the academic conferences I've been to this year, and in general, was it like a bad thing or a good thing? You know, so that's the philosophical, like deeply philosophical question behind that whole story. Was it a bad thing or was it a good thing? Because as a result, actually, all of our Korean people ended up in a very nice region, very friendly, very welcoming. They were saved and welcomed by the local people, like mostly by Kazakhs and Uzbeks that shared their food with them, that shared their land, which also became their land and their home. And like we all consider it our home countries. And I mean, they managed to prosper on that land, and from practically being used as a forced labor force, they became of one of the most respected minorities in our region, in our home countries. So yeah, it was a good thing for them. And if they had stayed in North Korea, probably their life, especially in the Hamgyong province, which is right now North and South Hamgyong province, is one of the most like remote areas in North Korea, where like they have been sending their unwanted people also for the last I mean, more than 50 years, 60 years, like as prisoners, right? And so like I think it's the poorest area in North Korea, also the most unfortunate area, just because of the natural conditions and political and social conditions on top of that. So yeah, they wouldn't have had such a kind of nice life at the end if they had stayed in there in North Korea. So on that, like from that perspective, we can say that it was a good thing. But like just morally, I think the whole thing of just uprooting people and by force taking them from their land, because they lived for over 70 years. They had lived for over 70 years before being deported already in Russia, like in the Primorsky Krai, and they also had, I mean, they had built a relatively successful life there. And so just the fact how that whole resettlement, forced resettlement or deportation occurred, and that they were just like uprooted in the matter of several weeks and months without any prior notice, just without any belongings, just put on those trains and like shipped somewhere into the unknown. And out of that 100, they were like roughly 200,000, like more accurately, almost 180,000 people. So we still don't know how many of them died. And we have those numbers in the classified archives of the Soviet secret police. And over the last 80 years, there was a short period of time when like that information was released, but then again it became secretive. So we technically, we don't really know. And there are two versions. Like all the Western and like South Korean academicians say that out of those 180,000 people, 40,000 people died. So it's like over 25%. It's between 25 and 30%. So 1/3 of the deportees died during and right after the deportation. And our sources, like in the former Soviet Union, because we tend to kind of show a little bit different picture of that deportation, so they say that there were maximum 10,000. So it's kind of the debate, were they 40,000 or were they 10,000? Which I don't know, like morally, how good, like to me, that whole debate about like how many thousand people died is like questionable. It's like, does it matter if there were 10,000 or 40,000 people who died? And then like how many children died and like elderly, and how many babies were not born as a result? So that's the moral question behind the deportation. And I think so. Yeah, we cannot really say. Maybe it's like in life, nothing is, like you can never say like this is good, this is bad. Like you have to see it as a complete picture. So I don't know, was it a good or a bad thing? But probably, yes, one good thing is that, yeah, we didn't end up staying in North Korea as it is nowadays. So I guess, yeah, it's a good thing that we all ended up living, like and being born and raised in Central Asia as a result of the former Soviet Union. So.
Yes. I just would like to say that it sounds like, of course, deportation is never really, it's never really a good thing. And, it seems like the Koreans who were deported did the best they could given that situation. And luckily, Uzbekistan was also so welcoming that you were able to share things together and own things together and not, and just live harmoniously together, even though you're completely different. And of course, immediately, what comes to my mind is, why can't that happen in certain areas of the world where they're fighting over one piece of land? Can't we just agree to share it and then, but I think it's so lovely that the Koreans and the Uzbekistanis were able to work together to come to a compromise. And I think it shows that there is hope in the world, that maybe you can share your ways with others and show them a good example.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comment. I appreciate your vision of it and your point of view. I think it's very important. I think it's one of the most crucial things, actually. Thank you very much for saying this. I just want to add, because I think it's very important to be added because of certain circumstances, that Uzbekistan recently became very badly known in the US for. Like, there was an incident, right, very unfortunate incident that happened in New York and was committed by the citizen. Well, he was not, I think he was American citizen back then, but he was originally from Uzbekistan. So somehow, in many places where people do not know about anything about Uzbekistan, my home country became associated with like other things, kind of bad things. People think that like those are bad and scary people. So one thing I want to say about Uzbekistan and our Uzbek people, Uzbek people, they have always been like Muslims, right? Traditionally and religiously, and as Uzbeks and as Muslims, they have always been welcoming guests and like all foreigners, all outsiders to their land. And when like those people came, Russian people, they started coming even before that, and a lot of actually unwanted Russian revolutionaries, like intelligentsia people, they ended up in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and Central Asia because of those of their remoteness of that region. Like Russian Tsar was like sending all the unwanted people there, like mostly Russian, like highly educated Russians there. So they were Christians, and they found their refuge there as Christians and in the lands of Muslims, and they were welcomed, and like it became their home. And then all Koreans came, and all other like prisoners and deportees came, like Chechens, Ingush, Iranians, many other, and also a lot of refugees, not the deportees or political prisoners, but the refugees came because there was later on in the Western world, the Second World War started in 1939, but for us, we called it Great Patriotic War in the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union. It started in 1941. So in the 1940s, when in the Western Europe and like in the Western part of the Soviet Union, they actually fought the actual war. They were trying to save people, like civil population, like women, children, elderly. So they were sending actually everyone to Central Asia because this is where the war was not being fought, so because this land was too far. So actually they were sending like orphans, and a lot of children came without parents. And actually back then, like Uzbeks also, like as Muslims, and like they didn't speak their languages, they didn't speak Russian, they were actually adopting those kids. So when they were bringing those children, so it's another like train journey, or a story of a different train journey. Because when the Second World War was being fought, like people were dying like in millions. So they actually had a lot of orphans, people like children without parents, and they just sent them all to Central Asia, like to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. And in Uzbekistan, actually the Uzbek people, there are like stories, also a lot of documentaries, movies made about that. Like they were adopting children in dozens. They were like, there was one family that adopted, I think, 16 children. Russians, Belarusians, like from all countries of the Soviet Union, and they didn't even speak their language, and like, but they adopted all of them, and like all of them became kind of Uzbek, and they started putting on like Uzbek clothes, and like, they gave them names, food, and I mean, they stayed like forever in Uzbekistan. So actually, like, we are very nice people. So I hope this is something you will remember about Uzbekistan. That we are not bad. We're actually very nice people, and I hope you all come visit. Yeah, yeah, please.
The For the first generation of Korea immigrants, my question is, were they able to get the Soviet Union citizenship quite sooner, or were they treated like foreigners quite for a long time? The reason why I'm asking this question is, in Japan, after World War II, there are lots of Koreans who refused to get Japanese citizenships, mostly from North Korea. At the time, Japanese government gave them Joseon citizenship, which did not exist at that time. And Japanese government could not give them a North Korean citizenship because the North Korea and Japan did not have the normal diplomatic relations. So like almost 30,000 of people, Korean people, haven't been protected for several decades. So I just wondered what was the situation in Russia and Uzbekistan.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a very good question, thank you. And yes, I have to tell you that unfortunately like the first generation of the deportees, they were paperless and like they didn't have passports. And they actually, they had some kind of paperwork probably, like some certain paper probably that would like identify them. But like they were Soviet citizens, all of them. I mean, all of them technically became Soviet citizens when like Tsarist Russia became Soviet Union, and like all Koreans living on the Russian territory, they automatically became Soviet citizens, because before that they were Russian. So all Koreans that had migrated to Russia before, they all were Russian citizens first. Like Russian Tsar's government was actually very benevolently giving them citizenships. I'll start at the very beginning actually. So the Russian Tsarist government was very benevolently giving them Russian citizenships until 1884, I believe. This is when Russia and Korea, still unified Korea, they start having diplomatic relations. And then Korean government actually wasn't happy that those Korean subjects had, kind of left or like kind of deserted. And so it was trying to claim them back, and it was telling Russian, like Tsar's government, give us back our Koreans. But because, the Russian government knew that they would be prosecuted, those Koreans would be prosecuted, and they needed people on that land. Actually, and the Koreans, like from the beginning, like wherever they were, those Koreans were very good at agriculture. They were developing those lands. They were actually giving a lot of benefits to the Russian land and Russian government and to the people. So it took the decision to do not deport them actually back then. Do not return them to Korea. It gave them like Russian citizenships. So they were all Russians, like they owned land, etc. Then when the revolution occurs, and after the revolution and Russia becomes Soviet Union, they all became Soviet citizens. Until 1937, this is when, before being deported, they were actually claimed as unwanted, not unwanted, but like unreliable. They were actually called like unreliable people. They were called like the enemy people because of the whole suspicion. Like there were a lot of reasons behind the deportation. And one political reason was that somehow the Soviet government was very afraid of the Koreans siding with Japan, because Korea back then was a Japanese colony, and Japan had been already aggressively moving towards Chinese and Russian lands on that side of the border in the Far East. And the Second World War was approaching, and Japan actually was sending their spies, like ethnic Korean spies and Japanese spies, because Korea was part of Japan back then technically as a colony. So they were actually training Korean and Japanese people and sending them into the Russian Far East. And because of that, and unfortunately because for the Soviet state, literally like they all had the same face, so they were afraid that those ethnically Korean and Japanese spies would just, live there and be there among the Korean population. So this is one of the reasons that just took all Koreans from that area and just moved them, right, shifted them to Central Asia. And they called them like unreliable subjects, like enemy subjects, because they actually said that they would side, like they believed that they would side with Japan. And as they were that part of like kind of suspect ethnicity, when they were brought to Central Asia until between 1937 and until 1953, when Joseph Stalin died. So until the moment of his death, they were actually treated as such, like enemy subjects, and they were kept on those collective farms. Those collective farms, they were very isolated, like farms populated by Koreans. So they had some paperwork identifying them, but they never had passports, and they were not allowed to move anywhere. So they were kept there by force, they couldn't move, they didn't have any paperwork. So that situation changes between 1953 and 56. So Joseph Stalin dies, and like the new leader arises, Nikita Khrushchev comes to power, and he tries to completely denounce and demolish the personality cult of former leader, of former dictator, Joseph Stalin. So by denouncing his personality cult, Khrushchev takes the decision to kind of grant those unwanted, because these were not only Koreans, but these were approximately, I think, 40 or 60 ethnic minorities, kind of bad ethnic minorities. So they give them their rights and freedom back, and they actually, this is when they start giving them passports, and they say they're fully fledged Soviet citizens, it was not their fault, they suffered. And this is when first generation kind of get back their identity and rights, and especially second generation. So for the first generation, already somehow they had suffered, they had lost time and life and effort, just being kind of abused and working very hard, being forced to work and kind of being forced to resettle. But for the second generation that was born there in Central Asia, that's a great timing, because they kind of, they are granted the fully fledged rights of the Soviet citizens from the beginning. So they can live freely, they can study, they can go to schools, they can go to the universities, and this is when they thrived. And they left and traveled all over the Soviet Union, they all studied and worked elsewhere. And this is when Korean colchozes also, they kind of, from those isolated and controlled collective farms, they just become somehow vibrant, collective farms. And all Koreans actually, the one interesting thing about this is that all Koreans stayed working there. So they were forced to do it originally, but then they voluntarily stayed, because they had already developed those collective farms, they had built their houses, their children were born and raised, they already had successful, they actually had amazing success as agricultural, to say, experts, and Koreans originally mostly, they had always been peasant culture, so they loved working with the land, and they were very successful with working on the land. So they had tremendous success just growing crops and rice, cotton, all kinds of agricultural crops, and jute. So during the Second World War, they grew jute. So this is one thing also, I don't have time to talk about other migrations to Mexico, to the US, but I think one similar thing is that everywhere, pretty much during the Second World War, Koreans grew cultures from which they could do jute, those ropes, which they used in the war, to make used for ships and bags and everything. So in Uzbekistan, they actually grew one particular type of a plant from which they produced that jute, and they were so good that they really had tremendous crops of that plant, and that they were even given hundreds of Koreans received the awards, and they were being called heroes of socialist labor, just because of how hard they worked on those fields. So their kids actually returned to work on those fields, and they all had their passports, and they kind of became fully fledged Soviet citizens, and they actually ended up still working on those collective farms and prospering. So.
We're going just beyond the organized time. So